How can we be greener with our houseplant collecting? On the face of it, it's a very green hobby already, but there are some sustainability challenges with houseplants, such as the importing of plants, the consumables that we use, as well as a lot of wastage in the industry. So I'm going to run through a few different tips of how we can be more environmentally friendly with collecting houseplants. Please do share in the comments below any that you already use, as well as any new ones that I've not added to the list, as I'd love to see those too. Now this is a remake of my first ever video for the channel, which when I watched back was really cringy because it was a terrible video, wasn't great sound, it was filmed on a phone, so hopefully this one will be much better and much more engaging. Now you might see this one that I'm holding for prop purposes does have some webbing on it. Now that isn't spider mites, that is actually a normal spider that I think has taken residence in the plant, so a little bit of natural pest control there when it's needed, and I'll touch on that again as we go through the video. So as I mentioned at the start, plants can have a lot of mileage attached to them, which means a higher carbon footprint, and this could be because they're exported from plant producing countries like the Netherlands and some in Asia and Australasia for example, and then distributed to the plant markets worldwide. Now if you can, try and buy plants that are domestically grown, and then that way you know you're reducing that carbon footprint because they haven't had to travel so far. And another good thing about this, or a potential benefit, is because they haven't travelled so far, you never know what sort of care they've had during that transport, how long they've been in transport, and whether that's going to put them in shock depending on whether they've been on cold aeroplanes or ships for example, and those different conditions that they change through during those long transportation journeys. So at least if they're grown domestically, they are much closer to home, hopefully, and will be a lot healthier for it too. And this next one leads nicely on from the first one, so if you want to get your plants domestically or reduce the transportation that they might have, then try growing them yourself. So this could be through propagating things from your own collection. Of course that will increase your greenery, but they will be the same varieties. If you do want new varieties to add to your collection, try looking online at plant groups or even local plant groups, maybe even friends that are fellow houseplant collectors, and then getting cuttings from them. They could be free or at least a lot cheaper than what you would pay for them in a store or online. So you can then grow them yourself from propagations and know that you're using a plant or plant material from something that was already in your locality, therefore reducing that carbon footprint and of course reducing the cost of growing your houseplant collection. And these next two lead really nicely on from propagation because you can use propagations with these next two methods. So plant swaps are one method where you can, of course, as the name suggests, swap a duplicate propagation that you've got in your collection or even a plant that you don't want anymore for another new variety. Now these are usually arranged in person. You might be able to find some that are online where maybe you post them. I've not seen those, but you can check to see if there are any in your locality and get involved that way. Usually you swap a plant for another plant of a similar value. So again, it is effectively free because you're exchanging a plant rather than money, or sometimes there might be a nominal fee to actually attend the event depending on how it's arranged. The next one is plant exchanges. So this is slightly different in that you're buying the plants that you're getting. However, these are usually from individual sellers or houseplant enthusiasts that are then selling plants in their collection or maybe propagations of plants from their collection. So this is a great way again to get plants for a lot less than you would pay from a standard retailer, and then you can find sometimes centrally organised exchanges on social media or websites for example. So I use a plant exchange on Instagram and that's a really great one to see what's coming up. But then you can also find individual sellers on places like social media, Etsy, eBay for example, where again you can buy the plants that they are then selling on from their own collection, and at least that way you know again they're either plants that are already domestic to you or at least duplicated or propagated from plants that are already domestic, so reducing all of that transport and carbon footprint with getting those plants into your collection. The only thing that you do need to bear in mind with those is just make sure that you do some checks to make sure they are legitimate sellers and you're not being plant scammed. So I'll link a previous video at the end. As I mentioned earlier, there is a video all about a plant scam that I fell victim to, and also the checks you can make to avoid being scammed and protect yourself should you be buying plants from an individual seller. Now this next one is more for online plant retailers, but of course you can check the green credentials of any in-store retailers that you decide to use. So this one is really about using retailers that are environmentally friendly, or at least environmentally conscious, that try to have sustainable business practices. So if you are buying from online retailers for example, obviously they have to post and package any plants that you've got that they're sending to you. So do they use lots of plastic tape, polystyrene for example, or do they use things like paper alternatives, corrugated card, paper tape, the paper packaging, or even starch chips instead of polystyrene chips. So all of these can give you a good indication of whether they are trying to be a sustainable and environmentally conscious business. You can also check online to see if they've got any sustainability policies, maybe things like carbon reduction or plastic reduction policies as well, to give you a good idea of what sort of business practices they have, and then hopefully reassure you that you're buying from an environmentally conscious business. Now we'll start this next section with a question: are you guilty of hoarding glass jars or bottles? So I definitely am, and this is an example. This was a soft drink bottle and now it's a propagation vessel. But anything that can be a propagation vessel will usually be saved to a limit. I've only got so much room in the kitchen, but I will generally save jars for that purpose. But this brings us on to reduce, reuse, recycle, which is a really broad topic, so I'll try and be as brief as possible and keep it to plant collecting. So of course we've already mentioned how we could reuse things, but the first step really is reducing what we bring into our homes, those sorts of consumables or things that maybe we do then need to recycle and then dispose of at some point in time. So if we can't reduce them, how can we then reuse them? So if we do need to bring things into our homes, maybe with a grocery shop for example, that's where we get most of these things, whether it's plastic bottles, plastic punnets or jars for example. They come into our homes, they are eventually going to end up in recycling or disposal, but how can we reuse them as much as possible to get the most out of their life? So this is a really good example, single-use plastic bottles. There are lots of ways. If you were to Google how to reuse these, you can find lots of really creative ways depending on how creative that you want to be. And again, when it comes to plants and plant collecting, so I generally use these for watering the plants rather than a watering can, as I've collected quite a few of these. And because of the large collection, it just means that I can fill them at once, or maybe even twice, depending on how many I've got at any given time, and then do a much more efficient watering of the plant collection. You can use things like mushroom trays and fruit punnets for starting off seeds, or even with propagations as well. If you're doing a tray of propagations with sphagnum moss or soil, even leca probably, you can then put them all in a tray and have a tray of propagations. And then the last thing, of course, when it comes to disposal, can it be recycled? Can you do it through your local curbside pickup, or do you need to take it to a recycling centre, or maybe even can it be composted, or is it biodegradable so it can go via those means, either in the compost or again if you have a curbside pickup for compostables, then you can possibly do it that way as well and make sure that they don't end up in landfill. Now one of the main issues with plant collecting is of course the plastic plant pots that you get. Now if you have a lot of plants in the collection, you'll probably end up with a lot of these. As you gradually pop them up over time, you end up with the spares left behind. Now that's good in one sense, because then you have a pipeline of different size pots. As other plants then need potting up, you've hopefully already got some in your storage that are ready to use, and then you can keep reusing them as much as possible. And generally these are quite sturdy and last a very, very long time. With these though, you might end up with too many and you want to get rid of some. You can of course again check your recycling, can they go in the recycling? Alternatively, while you might no longer want them, you can maybe give them away for free. They might be useful to someone else, someone that's maybe starting gardening or maybe needs them for their own plant collection. So you could use things like Facebook Marketplace, Free Cycle or free exchange sites where you can then either leave them outside for example and then someone just picks them up, or even knocks on the door to pick them up, because they could still then be of use to someone else. Alternatively, if you don't want this problem, this is a little bit more challenging, but you could try and find plants that are sold in things like kokedama or biodegradable pots, and then that way you're not going to have the issue of amassing lots of plastic pots. But that's still a little bit more challenging, a little bit more niche, and they are generally more expensive. So if you do end up with lots of pots, it's not a bad thing, but I'm sure if you don't reuse them yourself, someone else will. So on that same note, reducing your water usage. Now I am guilty of this, I need to be better with this. So this is obviously just using tap water for watering your plants. If you only have a few, then it's not too much of an issue. If you have a large plant collection, you'll know how much water that they need, particularly in the active growing season. So this is about using alternative methods to water your plants. Are there any other safe water sources that you can use where it's maybe reusing water? So it could be water from the coffee machine that's left over, it could be water from the end of your bottle, maybe at the end of the day, or water that you've had overnight. It could even be things from, like, if you've boiled any vegetables, let the water cool and then reuse that. anything that is safe to use with the plants. The main one, of course, is collecting rainwater, so you could do this with containers, or if you want to be more efficient and get a lot of water, you could use something like a water butt connected to your drainage, and then you can save a lot of rainwater. You know it's from a natural source because it's from the rain, and then of course you can just use that water as and when you need it, not just for your indoor plants, but you might find it useful if you have a garden too. You can then be more sustainable with your watering in the garden as well as a result. So that's one thing that I need to be better with, and something I'm currently looking into. Now, I appreciate how ironic this next one is, as I'm currently doing a grow light experiment, which you'll find the video on the channel if you're interested, and this is about reducing the electricity use that you use for supporting your plants. So not just with grow lights, but any other related plant tech, so devices like humidifiers, for example. Now, there are a few ways that you might be able to do this, and the main one is perhaps getting plants that are suitable for your natural space. So have a look around your home. What are the light levels like in certain rooms? What's the humidity levels like and the temperature, for example? And then picking plants that will naturally thrive in those conditions, and also maximising those spaces. So putting the plants closer to the light sources, for example, in order for them to get what they need from windows and the sun, for example, without the need for grow lights, or at least, if you do decide to use them, to reduce them down to use them as less as possible, because they're getting most of what they need from the natural light sources. Some other ways that you can try to reduce energy usage are, if you are using grow lights, then you can try and find ones that are more energy efficient, so you're getting the most out of the electricity that it's using, or also using things like timer switches or timer plugs, where you can then put them on for set times and you know that they will turn off after a certain time. So again, you're limiting that usage, and that goes the same for other devices like humidifiers, for example, just being conscious of how long they're on for when they are on, and obviously minimising that time as much as possible and checking their energy efficiency. Now, when it comes to buying bags of soil, and I will be using the term soil and compost interchangeably here, always try to buy bags of soil that are labelled as peat free. So while peat does have a beneficial impact to plants, it has a really negative impact on the environment. So if you need to do a little bit of research just to understand this in a little bit more detail, as I will only explain it incredibly basically, that there are peat bogs that have taken millennia to form. In these peat bogs, they actually contain or store lots of carbon dioxide, and I think methane gas as well. So when we harvest that to put it into the soil, that is released into the environment, those harmful substances, and obviously contributes to things like global warming. But because it takes so long to produce, that will never ever be replenished, at least not in our lifetimes, and probably not for a very long time in the future, if at all. So if you can, try and buy peat-free bags of soil. Now, more recently I have seen some products containing something called microfiltered peat, and this is a more environmentally sustainable way of collecting peat, and it doesn't impact the peat bogs either. So this is where peat is collected from natural runoff from the peat bogs. So rain will come down and it'll wash off into the rivers, for example, groundwater, and that is where the particles of peat are then filtered out and then added to the agricultural products, so bags of soil, for example. And this way there's no impact to the peat bogs, because it's all occurring as part of a natural process, bar the actual filtering out of the water at that stage. So of course the levels won't be as high as harvested peat, but at least you can get some of those benefits of having peat in the soil, but not the environmental impact. Now, the products that I have seen have also been certified as organic by the Soil Association. So this not only certifies the contents of the product, but also the sustainability of the practices of making the product. And I'll touch on what organic means in a little bit more detail later in the video, and it might not mean what you think it means when it comes to the labelling of different plant things. So stay tuned for that if you would like to learn more. But when it comes to buying bags of soil, always go for the peat-free option, or as an absolute maximum, the one with microfiltered peat, but always try to avoid anything containing harvested peat. And as I said, there are lots of other mediums out there, so coconut coir is another big one that's been used as an alternative to soil, or as a major part of mixes. So this was really all the rage a couple of years ago during the plant craze, when it became much more widely available and was very much touted as a sustainable alternative. But there are still some considerations on how sustainable it actually is, in terms of the amount of coconuts and coconut waste to actually produce the coir that we might need, but also in terms of the manufacturing process, so the chemicals and the amount of water that is needed to wash and clean and produce it can be high. So that brings into question the sustainability of it. Also sphagnum moss, another really popular one, a natural product at the end of the day, but also again questions around sustainable farming and where it's actually been harvested from. So again, those are things that you might want to research and check into before you decide to buy from certain manufacturers or retailers, to make sure you're happy with whatever their sustainability policies and practices are, so you know you're getting things from certified sustainable sources. And that's the same for any other products that you might decide to use in your mixes, like bark or worm castings, perlite or vermiculite. Just checking that they are produced by sustainable means, or at least means that you are comfortable with, depending on your level of how environmentally conscious you want to be. And there are also some really interesting alternatives out there as well. If you want to try something new, then try researching something called biochar, which looks like an interesting alternative to compost or soil, but also something called wool compost. So it's been made from wool waste, or at least the wool that isn't used for clothes manufacture, for example, and that has also been certified as organic. So really interesting alternatives to try if you want to try something different. Now, keeping with the organic or at least natural practices when it comes to fertilising our plants, of course you can go to the store and buy a fertiliser off the shelf. Now with these, they are often lab created. The benefit of this is that they have been carefully balanced with their NPK rating to give the maximum efficiency for what our sort of plants need and support our plants. But you can also get some natural alternatives, again store-bought, that aren't necessarily created in the same way. So things like blood and bone meal, sounds disgusting, but it's actually very beneficial for plants, and that's usually in a powdered form that you can mix into the soil. You can also get things like chicken manure pellets, so these are probably suitable for use indoors because they are just small pellets that you mix into the soil and they have a slow release. And then you can also get certified organic fertilizers that are created in that same sort of lab setting, I guess, but they are certified as organic and sustainable from that perspective. So you could try those as an alternative. They usually cost a little bit more, but if it is something that you are conscious of, then it might be something worth investing in. Alternatively, you can make your own. So you can use things like nettle tea or comfrey tea, where you stew those down effectively, let them sit for a while, and then you can dilute it down and use that as part of your watering schedule. And they have very high concentrations of all of the nutrients that your plants need, usually for different things. So some is more for greenery, some is more for fruiting and flowering. So you need to do a little bit of research just to confirm which is which. And usually things like nettles are readily available. If you don't have a garden, you'll find them easily in the wild and could take some of those without doing any environmental damage. Same with comfrey. You might need to do a little bit of searching for it, but once you find it, it's usually readily available in the spots that it actually grows. So they're just a couple of different alternatives that you can try. Do let me know if you know of any others in the comments below. Now the same principle applies when it comes to pesticides, so you can go to the store, buy them ready-made, and if you ever look at the back of those, you'll often see they will say they are fire hazards, they're irritants, not to spray them near aquatic life, that they can cause a hazard and need to be disposed of in a certain way. Of course we don't want to be spraying that around our homes, definitely not for ourselves, but if we've also got pets and small children, for example, we don't want that sort of stuff in our environment. So it's always good to have a natural alternative, and there are so many of these available. Really depends on the pest that you've got and the method that you want to use. So you could use a single product like neem oil, for example, that I've got here. You could mix them up to make solutions to make them more potent, again depending on the pest. So you can use things like hydrogen peroxide, essential oils, Castile soap, all different things that you can mix and then apply to plants in different ways to get rid of different pests. But it's not always about different solutions with chemicals or active substances. There are other ways that you can manage pests without the use of chemicals. So one is using something like the fly sticky traps, the little yellow stickers that you can put in plants. Now, of course, from a sustainability perspective, these will go in the bin at the end of the day, but it does mean that you can capture those pests without the need of chemicals. So that's one thing to possibly use. You can also use other methods that work in the same way, where you do also use natural ingredients, where it might be things like fruit juice or even water with sugar in, but you put a little bit of soap on top, and then when pests go in, they get trapped in the layer of soap and they can't actually get out. So that's another natural alternative without necessarily the use of chemicals, bar the little bit of soap that you might put on top. But then you've also got other methods such as general plant hygiene, getting rid of any dead plant material, cleaning the plant leaves, and maybe even putting them in the shower if you need to, just to get rid of any pests that might be hiding under leaves, and also even disease, avoiding any disease onset by getting rid of that dead plant material. Now this next one is perhaps a little bit more unconventional, and it really depends on your comfort levels as well as some other sustainability or even ethical considerations of whether or not it's right to introduce natural predators to an indoor plant setting. It really depends on which ones you might decide to use. So you've got things like nematodes, which are, you put them in water or mix them with water the plant with, and they usually get rid of larvae in the soil. They're usually used for fungus gnats. You can also get things like ladybirds and lacewings. They will get rid of larvae and eat aphids, for example. But then from that comfort level perspective and even that ethical perspective, you are then introducing insects that are usually outdoors into a home setting. It really depends on how large your plant collection is and whether or not you think it's fair to introduce those creatures to the indoor setting. So this one's a bit of a bonus. This one is an addition to the original video, and one that I thought of when I saw this. This plant was going to go in the bin. This one, for whatever reason, I thought it was dead, but then when I checked the stem, it was actually okay. And I put it near the grow light experiment and it started growing some leaves on the top. So this is a fantastic plant save from something that was going to go in the compost pile. So this is really about saving plants, again, not just your own plants, but also if you're going into stores, for example. I mentioned earlier in the introduction, there is a very high sort of waste issue with not just the plant market, but cut flowers as well. If they don't sell, if they're not looked after in stores, they will get wasted. It's just part of the industry. So if you see them reduced, if they are salvageable, check on your phones if you can save them. You can get a plant bargain and bring it back to full health with some TLC, and then hopefully you are saving some of that wastage by bringing it home and bringing it back to full health. And again, that goes for any that are in your collection. If they look dead, really check them, check the roots, check if they're from bulbs or corms, have they got any life in them and can they be brought back before you then put them on the compost heap. Now, as we're talking about naturally derived and even organic alternatives, I thought it would be useful to include a note about the difference between using organic in a description or calling something organically derived as opposed to something that is actually certified organic. And there is a big difference as to the end product that you'll be receiving and also the rigorous checks that they have gone through or not in the case of those just being called or described as organic. So there is a way to check, which I'll talk about in just a moment, but when we use compost, for example, that is a perfect example for this, as in theory any compost should be organic. It's made from broken down plant material, which is organic material. So by that reasoning, all compost should be organic. But it's not necessarily the case that all compost is certified organic or even certifiable organic. So when we've got compost, it's obviously been made, the components, it's broken down plant material, but what we don't know is whether the manufacturer has used then lots of chemicals or other maybe nasty things to clean it or get it to that stage, whether there's foreign objects in there, if it's not been filtered, if it's not been cleaned or processed in the right way, but also their business practices. Are they sustainable and along organic principles or not, as to whether or not that product can be certified as organic. So just because you see the word organic or organically derived or whatever that might be in a description of a product does not mean that it's certified and it's actually organic. Then when it comes to the certified products, these have gone through a really rigorous process, not only in checking the components that they are organic in nature, but going back a step to check how they've been farmed, grown or manufactured, that they have also followed organic or sustainable principles. Then looking at the manufacturer making the end product, making sure that they're not putting anything in it that would then take away from that organic certification, and also checking the wider processes of the organisation. Are they sustainable and in keeping with organic principles and that sort of eco-conscious focus as well? So lots of different checks, almost an audit trail to make sure that the end product will be certified organic, as opposed to those that just have it in the description because they are made up of what is actually technically organic material. So keep that in mind, and if you are looking for specifically organic products that are certified, then you can always double check this by looking for some sort of badge or accreditation, which will usually be on the product. So there are many different ones out there and they will differ by country, so you can always check what it is for your particular country or region. Now in the UK and Europe you'll often see the Soil Association. It might be further afield as well, but you'll usually see that here. Then also you've got the USDA organic certification in the US. There's another one in Europe as well with leaves on it. I can't remember exactly what it's called, but if you just Google it and find out what it is for your area, you'll be able to be confident that what you're buying is actually truly certified organic and follows those sustainable principles, as opposed to those ones that just sneakily drop it in to the description where they are allowed to. As I said, it goes beyond just the organic materials that make it, but also the sustainability of the processes. So do you follow any of those practices to be more sustainable with your houseplant collecting, or do you have any others that I've not yet mentioned? Please do share them in the comments below, because they'd help me out, but they'd also help out other viewers. If you have found the video useful, consider subscribing, as I'll have new videos usually every week on plant related topics. I'll link my previous video at the end, which was about plant scams and the checks that you can make if you're deciding to buy plants from plant exchanges or reseller sites. Checks you can make to hopefully make sure that you are buying from legitimate sellers, and also the protections you need to be aware of, so that should the worst happen, you are protected. So watch that next if it is of interest, and as I said, you can find lots more videos on the channel. If you've got any questions, put them in the comments below and I'll respond to everyone, and as always, thank you for watching Grow Your Wellbeing.